working. Keep it going. Moving on to the coronavirus. So we have an article here about the creator of U.S. Bioweapons Act, which is a United States piece of legislation who Dr. Francis Boyle was involved with creating, has basically come out publicly and said that the coronavirus is a biological weapon. We've talked about this before. We've been kind of predicting. It was one of our team members, Todd, who first noticed that where this outbreak was happening, where it was starting and starting to spread, was actually near the Chinese version of the CDC. And Todd, you actually shared a very interesting article here about tracking the coronavirus from B&O. Would you mind talking a little bit about what you found so interesting in both of these articles and how it might compare to some of what the mainstream is talking about?
Well, the tracking coronavirus is actually a live site, so it's getting updated anytime that there's some sort of an update. It's similar to the Johns Hopkins site that a lot of people are pointing to nowadays in the media, but I find that their information is a little more granular. So you can see right now as you zoom in, you can start seeing where certain data points are coming from. So I imagine these might be different hospitals or checkpoints or something. I'm not sure exactly. You can see the two black ones. That's indication of the highest infection rate. And just to the southeast of there is where the level 4 lab is. That lab is tied to the Chinese government and the WHO, the World Health Organization. It's had leaks in the past, and it wouldn't shock anybody that this one's leaked as well. There's a lot of geneticists that have looked at the code and have identified 2 different splices into the genetic code, suggesting that it's been man-made.
I think it's definitely man-made. I think that is proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The fact that it's called the novel coronavirus, we shared this on our Facebook. Novel is a legal term used by intellectual property lawyers to mean created, unique, man-made. And then you mentioned all these different genetic indicators that it's man-made. I think we're past the question of is it man-made or not? But on our Patreon discussion, I believe you mentioned it could now mutate or change or go beyond its intended use case was. I think we're seeing that play out. And also on our Patreon site, so we were talking a little bit, and Tony, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, about people say it's not as dangerous as the regular flu, so nobody should worry, but you found some good reasons to think that that's not accurate. Would you mind sharing those with the usual suspects?
That's a common thing you hear, especially in the alternative media, even people saying that it's not as bad as the flu because the flu kills between 35 and 60,000 people a year, according to the CDC. Well, when you dig a little closer, it's not that the flu kills that many people. It's often complications from the flu, like pneumonia, especially people over 65 or maybe more susceptible to it. So they basket the category of flu and flu-like issues into the flu deaths to overinflate it, because if you said 700 people a year died from the flu out of 300 million, you wouldn't necessarily want to go get your flu shot. So they have overinflated that number for a number of years to really change the statistics to make it seem a lot larger than it is.
You were mentioning, too, that there is a possibility it was related to flu shots or vaccines. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I shared a link. There was a researcher who was studying the virus itself and noticing that was recombinant, and possibly it was due to a vaccination program gotten loose in China, just the way it was spreading and cropping up in different places to suggest that it wasn't the marketplace or the even point of contact. But if there was a vaccination program that had it, that could explain why it's happening in a variety of places all at once.
That brings up an interesting question, because if it was part of a vaccination program, was it something that just went wrong, or was it intentional? The question of what was the intent of that program, I don't think we'll ever know the answer, but it does raise depopulation issues. It does raise Deagle report issues.
Yeah, the history of vaccinations and testing often is to see what this will do. So there's a testing side of it. So sometimes things get out maybe further than they want, or maybe it's intentional. I mean, Lyme's disease is a classic one. It could have been an unintentional release that had gone on. But certainly there's intentional things that are put in there, such as sterilization drugs and things like that have been found. They claim, whoops, somehow that slipped in there. So I think there's some that are intentional and some that they just have are unintended consequences.
And Todd, could you tell a little bit to the audience listening your opinion on the differences in the data that we're seeing from, for example, the Johns Hopkins versus the B&O site? Maybe some of your impressions about that.
different channels of filtering, and you get data in from all different sources. So first you got to narrow the sources down. I believe they have a few different sources, a few similar sources between the two sites, and then your own way of filtering through that and how you want to display it. There's all sorts of really helpful ways and very manipulative ways to do that. I'm not suggesting one is the other, but John Hopkins is going to be more in bed with the WHO and the government narratives versus that other site I shared is their news source out of the Netherlands. So they don't really have any, to my knowledge, I'll be glad to know if someone finds out otherwise, influence from one of these organizations as far as a financial interest or a invested interest somewhere.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to allude to, because at least in the American media, it's all about the John Hopkins research, not the B&O research, which do have some pretty significant differences in what they're reporting. So I kind of get the feeling, the impression that maybe the John Hopkins is less concerning of reporting, and maybe that's why the narrative is being structured based on their data rather than what other people are reporting, almost like a panic control kind of thing, maybe.
I mean, the mainstream, when you think, who am I going to trust when it comes to health data? And everyone's John Hopkins when it comes to health.
Right.
And then this no-name news agency out of the Netherlands is producing stuff, the credibility thing, that a lot of mainstream are worried about.
I find it funny because whenever the FCC tells me 5G is safe, their credibility is immediately diminished in my mind because I know who they are and who runs it. So you have to take the concept of credibility with a big grain of salt nowadays, because all of these institutions have financial, political, cultural ties into the corporatocracy. So the question of credibility is very nebulous today, nowadays, particularly the global warming narrative, for example. It's just one example out of many. GMOs, everything is fine and safe and nothing to see here is what is coming out of a lot of these sources. So you have to be very aware of that. Xavier, you had one of the most interesting observations about the linguistics of what is happening between coronavirus and the people who claim they're developing the cure. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and now in the amount of time since the Patreon bill and this show, I can't remember Nova.
I'll refresh your memory.
Please, because I knew I was going to forget.
My mind was kind of blown whenever you made the observation that we're in a time of very interesting solar activity, and now all of a sudden coronavirus comes out, corona being like the corona of the sun, and then the company charged with creating I guess you could call it a cure or a vaccine or whatever for the coronavirus happens to be called Nova. Nova Site is the name of it. And Cyril, I think it was you who made the observation that it is bizarre messaging. So very similar to how you find examples of hinting at disasters in media and in the names of companies and things, or whenever there's a training exercise that just happens to be the exact event, like on 9/11 that happened, they happen kind of simultaneously. I'm wondering if perhaps coronavirus, Nova, grand solar minimum, all of this stuff, is this perhaps a messaging effort, a revelation of the method, as Tony often refers to, of a really serious global problem? And does that couple in with the Deagle report? We have 5 years to realize some kind of catastrophe, according to the Deagle report. Are we seeing some of that play out here? And I'm not trying to fearmonger, but the coincidences with coronavirus seems to be starting to strain credulity. It's starting to be a little bit mysterious to me. I don't know. Any thoughts from you guys?
Yes, lots.
Yes, just yes. Yeah, I mean, so Deagle report is claiming that in 5 years, Western civilization is going to take a big hit. And perhaps, well, not just Western civilization, I mean, the whole planet, but particularly bad in places like America, Great Britain, where we're going to see a tremendous drop in population. If you don't know what the Deagle report is, just search for it. And then when you get to the website, it's going to appear itself like a CIA front. They're reselling military equipment. But towards the bottom, there's a link to other country info. And when you open that up, there's actually this much larger database of predictions of population changes. And we've long been reporting that this potentially could be an estimate or a prediction of what's going to happen in the year 2025. And we've often talked about that things like GMOs, 5G, vaccines, all of the poisoning of the planet that we're observing here in again, that totality of circumstances might be the method or the agenda to make the predictions of the Deagle Report true. So definitely check that out.
There's another point that I kind of remember David Devine from Adapt 2030. He's pointed out that a lot of the Chinese dynasties collapsed during grand solar minimums. And it's like we have all this information, all these data points, and we have history to correlate it with. To me, it seems like we're in the beginning of a turnaround, and the stock market's through the roof. The repo market is teetering, and this definitely gives the world economy justification for a collapse based on something like this. And also, the Chinese people believe their rulers are supported by God. God allows these people to be our rulers, and if bad things happen to the people, then the people are going to say, hey, you're not ruling us. We need someone else. And so this could also be some very internal dialogue happening in China, or the old team getting booted out and the new team coming in. And when we look at the false flag events that have happened throughout time, especially 9/11 and 7/7, they're always running out the scenario right before or during. And the timing of this corona outbreak with what happened in New York, I believe it was in New York, right, last year with the mock scenario of this.
Yeah, it was in New York.
To me, that's just too close in timing. The timing's perfect. So I think we just need to be very suspect and realize that there's the coronavirus and then there's the Wuhan virus. And there's also 5G is from Wuhan. So there's lots of other dots to be connecting. In big picture, like to me, this is the implications for the New World Order, because 9/11, the stage wasn't set to implicate the agenda. And climate change isn't really doing it as fast as they want. But with this kind of virus or this kind of pandemic, this could really usher in a lot of the agenda that they weren't ready to roll out yet. So to me, this is like setting the stage. Actually, the stage has been set. And now to me, it seems like they're just rolling out, and they'll get as much as they can of the agenda through this as they can. And to me, the global carbon tax was like the last missing link. And now the timing of this pandemic, everyone's talking about mandatory vaccines. And so there's lots of things that we should be paying attention to.
I have a couple thoughts on that. So I don't think global warming was doing it anymore. I think that the global warming narrative is starting to get pecked away slowly. The planet is actually going to be colder, not warmer. So I think that whole New World government to stop global warming kind of approach might be slowly getting reduced in possibility. So now there's this virus. And like you said, everybody has to be vaccinated. We can't have so many people anymore. We have to depopulate because the spread of infection is a huge risk now. So I do think that you're spot on, that they're creating another villain to point at the reason why we all need to just say, okay, and bow down to the one world government, the corptocracy. The 5G observation is huge. I want to really emphasize that Wuhan is where 5G started, and Wuhan is where the coronavirus started. And I can't help but think that the biological and physical impacts of 5G on your health, in conjunction with a man-made created virus, to me, Wuhan has become like a petri dish, a testing ground for what they anticipate doing across the rest of the planet to make the Deagle report happen. And for those of you who think that the idea of testing grounds is too brazen, too publicly noticeable to actually do in practice, I think, Gary, our experience in Virginia is a perfect example of where you test the corptocracy's ability to take away rights, to enforce something onto somebody as a testing ground to see what you can get away with. I think the Richmond gun rally was a perfect example of what type of reaction will we get, what will we see, and how the rest of the world, what their perspective of what we're doing will be before we actually roll it out globally. Sorry, I just kind of did a rant there. Anybody have any thoughts on any of that?
Boston was another example of that testing as well.
The Boston bombing?
Yeah, and how they implemented martial law essentially across the population to see how they would comply, and certainly they did.
Absolutely, yeah. So I cannot overemphasize the fact that Wuhan is the origin point of both coronavirus and 5G. Are they testing what happens to your body when exposed to both? I guess we'll find out. But that observation...